Hello, I'm Glenn Poole from the Australian Men's Health Forum. Welcome to this latest Men's Health Connected session. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we meet from around Australia. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Bailey, the Bunda Bunda, the Gureng and the Grang mob, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today is the last in our series on social connection and men's health. We have had something like a dozen sessions over the last month with about 20 speakers, and a couple of hundred people in all have shown up and participated in those sessions. And all of that has been driving us towards this final conversation, which is to reflect on how we as a sector can turn the conversations we've been having and some of the actions that are already happening to build better social connection in men. How can we turn that into policy? And so this session I've called now the mateship crisis, turning action into policy. And in practical terms, what I'm going to do today is going to reflect back some of our findings over the past 3 or 4 weeks and to mark out some areas where I think we as a sector can take action to tackle social isolation and build social connection in men. We're going to go over the headlines here. I'm not going to go deep down into extensive detail on each area, but we will be compiling our findings into a more detailed report, which you'll be able to read when it's out. And thanks for those who've shown up today. Please do follow along, put any comments or questions in the chat box. I don't intend to take more than about 15 minutes on these slides, but I would love to have some conversation with you and particularly get your feedback on thoughts on our suggestions on where next. So I guess the next thing to do is for me to share my screen. Welcome to those who have joined since the welcome. Good to see you, Wayne, Jack, Ali, Ben. Do please pop your details into the chat box and say hello so people know where you're joining us from. Let's have a go at sharing the screen. Bear with. Should be good at this by now. There it is, Microsoft PowerPoint share. Thanks to Kim for her excellent work pulling together these slides with just 24 hours notice. She makes my work look beautiful, which isn't easy always. Okay, so the mateship crisis. How do we turn action, and there's lots of action going on in the men's health sector, how do we turn that action into policy? Well, let's just review the conversation we've been having over the past month. Our hypothesis is that there are too many men in Australia who lack the opportunity to build, maintain and experience mateship in their lives. And this is a major social problem. And it really is as important to men's health as doing things like tackling smoking or reducing risky drinking, getting men more active, or encouraging men to lose their weight or go to their GPs to get screened. It's part of a mix of actions that we can take to improve men's health, is building social connection in men. So why mateship? We did a bit of desk research, and I found just in the past couple of days, found a great YouGov survey which looked into Australian values. It was done in the last 12 months. And it sort of found, not surprisingly, that mateship is still considered one of the top 3 Australian values. Mateship is a uniquely Australian or Antipodean characteristic. You wouldn't find this in other countries, mateship being identified as a national value. And it seems to be a value that on a personal level is valued a little bit more by men than women. And in terms of, so when we talk about mateship, we're often talking about mostly talking about male social bonds, men's friendship with other men. Though, of course, we understand that friendship and social connection can include women and people of other genders too. But we're mostly talking about male-male friendship. And part of the reason for that is for most men, their closest friend is another man. Most men have pretty much mostly male friends. And men also generally will find it easier to make friends with men than women. These are all generalizations, you'll understand. And one of the key places where men find their mates and social connection is through the workplace, and men are much more likely to operate in male-dominated workplaces than they are in female-dominated workplaces. So there's lots of reasons when we talk about social connection in men to focus on male friendship in particular. So we assert that mateship is in crisis. It's not just an Australian phenomenon. It's been spotted in different countries around the world, most starkly with the research out of the US, which shows this massive change in the number of friends that people have over the last 30 years, and has done the research in terms of gender breakdown as well. So yeah, number of men with close friends falling from 55% to 27%. Number of men with no close friends rising from 3% to 15%. Lots of we don't have the same type of data out of Australia, but lots of data from lots of different bits of research gives us a good indication that around 1 in 4 men in Australia lack good mates and social connection. And we'll share all the different ways we've come up with that figure in our more detailed report. But a fair estimate is that 1 in 4 men lack good mates. Just to remind you, I'm sure everyone on this call will know, but men's health is in a bit of a crisis as well. And here are some of the key stats that back up that assertion, particularly issues like suicide, but not just suicide, heart health, unavoidable deaths, life expectancy. And we actually lose 50 men a day in Australia from preventable causes. And research shows that actually social connection has a significant role to play in all of those key areas of health. It's been reliably found, the absence of social connection has been reliably found to lead to a shorter life expectancy, worse physical health outcomes, worse mental health outcomes, an increased risk of suicide, and then into later life, an increased risk of dementia. The startling fact, I don't know if you include it in this slide, but we haven't. The lovely factoid that's often quoted these days is lack of social connection is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So in terms of gender differences, this is one very reliable piece of data comes out of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. When asked if you have family and friends to confide in, men are twice as likely to say that they have no friends and no family to confide in. Nearly 1 in 5 men make that statement, nearly twice as many as women. So we pulled back and we looked more broadly at what is social connection. This piece of work comes out of Swinburne University, and we were very lucky to have Professor Adam Carr come along and speak to us and talk about all the work they do in terms of understanding and mapping and measuring social connection. So this is social connection across the whole of society, not just in men, but it conceptualizes social conception as a range of overlapping circles from our closest relationships, our partners, our family, our friends, the broader community and the wider community. They're all important, and ideally we would have a mix of all of them. So we also managed to get hold of quite a lot of data and research, which helped us deepen our understanding of some of the differences between men and women in terms of how they experience social connection. So, for example, we and this will probably, again, none of these things will probably surprise you, but it was good to find the data to back it up, that men are tend to be more reliable on their female partner for social connection, tend to be less connected within families. Brothers, fathers, sons, uncles tend to be less socially connected within a family than sisters, mums, aunties. Up to about the age of 55, men are also far more likely to live alone. That tends to flip in later life because men are more likely to die early, so more women are left in older age living alone. Men are less likely than women to have not have any contact with people outside of their home, and as already highlighted, twice as likely to have no family and friends to confide in. So there's some quite clear distinctions in the way that men and women are and are not socially connected. And when you look at the connections in terms of family and people outside of the home and the absence of those connections, it kind of really emphasizes why mateship is an important part of social connection for men. There's been lots of research over the years on some of the sex differences between men and women and how they socially connect. As always, with these types of studies, it's important to note these are averages, they're not absolutes. It's not Mars and Venus, but there's plenty of research to show that those sex and gender differences between the way that we do friendship start to emerge as adolescence approaches. So broadly speaking, little girls and little boys aren't that different, but as adolescent approaches, what we value in friendships starts to shift. It won't surprise you to know that boys tend to be more action orientated, more into fun, companionship, activity. Girls more sort of intimacy, talk orientated, and that extends into adulthood as well. With some people observing, like Professor Dunbar, who's famous for the Dunbar number, that we can only manage. We're only evolved to manage about 150 social connections. He does state, in almost like Mars and Venus terms, that men and women live in very different social worlds. We have different interests, different foci, and different social styles when we look at our friendship groups. Again, generalities, not true necessarily of all men and all women. So it's not surprising then when you start to look at projects that are working to build social connection. And we had a whole host of great initiatives that came along, people like the Man Walk, the Men's Table, Mentoring Men, In a Man, Solid Men. There's a whole list. And when if you weren't present, I encourage you to come back and to our website and see the recordings of those sessions when you have time. And also maybe, Kim, you could share some of the links to some of the articles you wrote about those sessions as well in the chat box. So those familiar with men's work will be very familiar with the phrase, shoulder to shoulder or side by side. And a lot of men's projects actually, they lean into that male way of doing things, the male-friendly approach. They work with the conventional norms, they're action-orientated, they get blokes together for a walk, for a barbecue, in a shed to build things. But also you get many projects that will actually place a focus on shifting those norms, leaning into more vulnerable, face-to-face, heart-to-heart, deeper, authentic connection between men that people who've worked with men's circles over the years will be very familiar with. And it's probably unfair to say there's a group of projects that do this side by side, traditional way, and there's a group of projects that do the other heart to heart, the modern way, because there's often an overlap between the two. The entry point to a men's group will often be more focused on side by side, activity based, but over time, the connections that men make often expand gender norms and allow for deeper, more authentic, less stoic conversation. So we can talk about men as a group distinct from women, but it's also, as a lot of men's health conversation does, it focuses on the differences between men and women. But it's also really important to recognize there are many differences within men. This is not an entire list, but clearly when you look at lack of social connection, there are certain groups of men that are going to be at different levels of risk. Living alone is obviously a risk factor, being unemployed, experiencing conflict, not being in work is a major risk factor. Your actual geographic location, whether that's rural, remote, or living apart, or living a good distance away from family or friends, having certain health issues and disabilities. We didn't really get to lean into the world of disability, and I think that's an important one for us to look at in future. We certainly looked at some priority groups. I think we come to that in a minute. I think one of the things to look out for is transitions as well. I often, as we've been having this conversation, I imagine how things shift for boys as they become adults, thinking about when we were at school, we were constantly forced into large community where social connections happen because we had to go to school every day. And often as we move out into the real world, we don't have that benefit of being forced into community through school. And then we suddenly have to actually become more responsible for making our own connections. So that transition out of education and or into university, going into a new job, losing a job, moving home, certainly moving town or city, going in and out of relationships, coming in and out of prison, coming in and out of the armed services, lots of different transitioning from work into retirement, lots of transitions where actually men may suddenly become at risk of losing social connection because the setting they were previously in was providing social connection, which they then lose when they move. Some of the priority groups, we've had some conversations with some priority groups. So we had a roundtable on culturally and linguistically diverse men. We had a roundtable on veterans, and there's also certain groups that we had a great session on different projects working with older men. And there's also there's other groups that we didn't have time really to focus on in this past month, but we are mindful of. I think it's important for us to sort of consider, well, do those groups require specific men's groups, men's groups for culturally and linguistically diverse men, men's groups for veterans, men's groups for Aboriginal men, or do more sort of mainstream existing men groups need to work harder to include those groups of men? I was really struck by Billy Beggs from the Penrith Man Walk, where they get up to 200 or 300 blokes on a Thursday night in Penrith for the Man Walk. The amazing work they're doing, reaching out into different communities of men within their town in order to make the Man Walk more inclusive. They're a really nice model of how you take a well-established mainstream group and then do outreach work in order to make it more inclusive. A bit of a model in terms of the different types of interventions that we might need to build social connection. So many of you will have seen these sort of layers before, the idea of universal interventions for everyone, selected interventions which target different populations, and indicated interventions where people actually get referred into some kind of service. And I think all of those are important. A lot of the work we looked at in terms of things like what Professor Adam Carg was talking about, looking at sort of how large sports facilities can promote universal social connection, initiatives like Neighbours Every Day and 1000 Play Streets from Relationships Australia and Play Australia are about making sort of universal initiatives that are attempting to make neighbourhoods more socially connected, to make streets more socially connected. We didn't really do a lot of stuff on the indicative kind of intervention. How do you actually engage the most isolated men who actually, for whom maybe joining a group would be just a step too far? And I think we just need to acknowledge at this stage that we haven't done a lot of work looking at that, and there's more to explore. I would say that most of where we focused, and perhaps the place where to start with, the men's sector has the most to offer, is in that kind of selective, targeted approach, groups that specifically are open to men of all backgrounds. And I think that's it's a really important contribution, because what we find, as is typical across many different sectors, is that a lot of the existing universal approaches and many of the selected approaches that are maybe targeting, say, older people, generally don't take into account gender. And then when you actually look at evaluations and audits, we find that, 60, 70, 80% of the people they were engaging were women. So a lot of existing initiatives in the world of social connection are often, they appear to be gender neutral and open to everyone, but they're kind of reinforcing that sort of gender inequality by not actually placing a focus on how do they include men. So there's a couple of pieces there to us to contribute, which I'll come back to. So we then have reflected across sort of 4 different spheres about what kind of initiatives would you need? What kind of initiatives would you need to build more social connection in men? What would you need to provide at a personal level, at the interpersonal level, at a practitioner level, and a policy level? And each of those 4 levels requires different types of interventions. When we initially started this process, my expectation was that we'd only really be focusing on policy at this stage. But having gone through the process, it's made me realize that actually there's stuff we have to offer potentially at the practitioner and interpersonal level too. So that's the last slide. So let me just go back to the slide before last, just to fill that piece out. I had another slide coming. So just to sort of to fill that out a little bit more and highlight where I see the 4 areas are that that we can take action. So if you start at a policy level, rather than us developing a sort of a big policy document and advocating to the government to create a social connection for men policy, we realize there are existing initiatives and campaigns out there that are working to put to encourage government to put greater focus on social connection, notably the Ending Loneliness Together initiative. So something we can do straight away is kind of sign up and support them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but also within that, we can be making the case that that sector, that existing advocacy needs to place a greater focus on men, and in particular the social benefits of projects that promote mateship. Down at the practitioner level, we started to realize that there's already lots of existing initiatives, and like I said, many of those initiatives, if not most of those initiatives, aren't taking into account the needs of men. So again, there's an opportunity there to go where the action already is, but provide some simple tools on best practice approaches to making sure you include men in those projects. So we don't have to wait for the government to take action. We can engage with existing practitioners. And indeed, many of the people who turned up to the conversations we've had in the past couple of weeks, they've been community development officers, they've been people who work in neighborhood houses, they've been people who work in local governments who've said, you know, it's my job to engage and connect the community, but up until now, I've never really thought about how I can do that with men. So in a sense, we're already doing that work by making this conversation public. At the sort of individual personal level, I think there's potentially work to be done developing tools and tips for men directly and people working with men. I think we need to do a bit more work in that area before we start telling other people how to do their job. But there are some good existing tools out there looking at the benefit of things like tackling loneliness through CBT, through mindfulness, through positive psychology, things like that, to actually manage the impact of loneliness, plus also some sort of guides on how to actually go from being socially isolated to build your social connection. So there's work already being done out there which we can look at and build upon. But I think the green area is probably the area where we bring the most unique benefit at the interpersonal level, because the men's sector is already doing this thing of building groups as the men's shed movement did. There are many more groups now, mostly driven by men of sort of working age, sort of 35 to 65, this explosion of men's groups, informal men's groups, often volunteer-led, that are building mateship. You know, a couple of examples, we had the Man Walk with over 80 walks around the country, and we had the Tough Guy Book Club, again with over 80, 90 chapters around Australia, each providing opportunities of social connection across every state and territory in Australia, run on an entirely voluntary basis, with the founders struggling to find funding to dedicate the time to take their projects to the next level. So I think there's a great piece of work we can do to champion the work that's already happening and to actually advocate for funding and support for those projects, but also to connect to some of the smaller initiatives, which maybe have 1, 2, or 3 groups, or maybe 4, 5, or 6 groups, who are wanting to grow and develop and can learn from the other groups, and also some great groups that are based on one location, and supporting them to actually look at, well, what do we want to do next? Do we want to just deepen the work that we do in our one location and do more of that work for more men, and better work, or do we want to look at how we can scale what we've done in this one location and replicate it across the country? So I think there's a really interesting piece of work for the Australian Men's Health Forum to do with its members and other organisations to really collectively build our capacity to deliver social connection projects to men, and in doing that, we'll also build our capacity to do work across the other circles. So we'll build our capacity to provide tools to practitioners and tools and tips to men. We'll be in a better position to actually advocate to existing initiatives and projects that are engaging with the public, but don't really understand how to engage with men effectively. We'll be in a better position to work in partnership with initiatives like Ending Loneliness Together to make the case to government to take more action to tackle social isolation and build social connection. That's me. That is now the end slide. And as it says on there, thank you. So I shall stop sharing. I see there's a bit of chat going on in the chat box. I would really let me just, if you've got any questions or comments, stick up a hand. But I'm just going to go back and have a look through the comments to see if there's anyone got any comments in there. But Alan, is it possible to obtain a copy of these slides, as these are interesting info? I'm glad you find it interesting. Yeah, I can share the slides. Like I said, we'll also be turning it into a report, Alan, as well, but happy to share the slides. I see Kim's been sharing some of the articles. Alan, you got a point there on vets. Do you want to jump in and just sort of share that observation?
Look, just what we hear, what I hear through DVA and other younger veteran service organisations more so, tends to be the younger vets who don't stay in for the full term, say 6 years, who come out what's called medical discharge or an admin discharge, or discharge because they got, for whatever reason. So they go in younger, well, like I went in at 17 and a half myself, and the ADF provide that mateship, that connection that we've been talked about, and all of a sudden they lose it, especially when they are not really transitioned correctly. There are transition programs, but I wonder what really happens in them, and also wonder if every veteran, male or female, says you must attend this, like this is an order, you must attend it to find out what you have to do next. Whereas those who come out have done 25, 35 years are probably in a better space because they've got a family, they're more settled, they've got super, etc., etc. It seems to be the ones who've come out with less support for whatever reason, but the social connection you're talking about, because there's a lot more smaller ESOs running around for younger veterans, they are providing that support in one way, shape, form or another. But at the end of the day, the client has to help themselves. So if the man or the woman, if you're talking about ADF people, don't put their hands up and go looking, and maybe they don't know where to look either. So is it the chicken or the egg? I suppose that's what I'm saying. But I get a feeling that some are slipping through the net when they leave the ADF because they haven't been informed of what to do next. From simple things of how do I apply for a Medicare card to I've never had to rent before. Yeah. All of a sudden they've got to provide rental buddy references, which is in Australia going to be pretty hard anyway. So it's multifaceted just for that area of its own. I guess that's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, no, thanks. We had a session, a round table session on veterans. I noticed, I don't know if he's actually live on the mic yet, but just as you started that point, Steve Turnbull from Mates for Mates, who was at the Veterans Roundtable session, joined us. Steve, are you able just to jump in and sort of give us any insight for those who weren't at that roundtable on some of the issues that were raised in that roundtable, and also some of the interventions that are actually out there and working?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for having me join in, Glenn. I was bouncing from one meeting to another. Some of the interventions that are working. Look, there are a lot of social connection activities out there, and you'd be sure to know many of them from around the place. I guess what I would say is a lot of those tend to focus on physical activities, and there are good reasons for that. It's good to get out and get the heart working and keep the body functioning. But a lot of veterans leave defence because they have illnesses or injuries. And so they're either not close enough geographically to attend a bushwalk, a bike ride, a hike, a surf, something like that, or they're sufficiently injured or impaired that they're just not capable of doing those things. And that can be another reminder of what has been lost from their time in service. So we focus a lot on doing all sorts of activities, craft-based activities, drawing, painting, creative writing, anything we can do that generally sits in a mindfulness space. I work for Mates in developing and executing online support services. So literally what we're doing here. So I can't do physical stuff, but we've found tremendous success in just engaging people any way you can think of that enables them to connect with other veterans. It's not really so much about what they're doing. It's about the fact that they're doing it in the presence of others who have shared similar experiences. And so you can connect that bond really quickly. I think one of the things we spoke about too was the ability to trade on that bond. So, finding those connection points that enable veterans to trust each other quickly and embrace each other quickly, but not letting them get stuck there. So helping them find a life beyond defense rather than continually looking back over their shoulder at what was and what has been. So again, in this environment, we trade on that shared experience, even though it might be 20 or 30 years apart in some cases, but defense is still defense. It's still hurry up and wait. It's still training in the rain. It's still all of those activities that are unique to that environment, but then using that to form a relationship that continues in its own speed and pace forward rather than dwelling on what was lost. So if you can, anything you can think of that will help bring those people together from that common foundation, but then lead them into relationships that will bring them forward and find meaning and purpose away from what was. I think somebody said, I wish I'd got notes somewhere, but somebody said in that your service life was important. It's an important part of who you are, but it's not the only part of who you are. And then, we want to embrace it and celebrate it and honor it at the same point of saying, but that is not the sum total of who you are. There are other parts that you can now explore. There are other options that you now have. I mean, there might be even skills. Defense doesn't seem to have a lot of use for writing and poetry and painting and clay work and all that sort of stuff. And yet there may be within each person this entire new skill set that they've never explored that opens up a whole new sense of purpose and being. And that's what we're keen to try and get involved in. I was impressed. There's a lot of stuff, volunteering, disaster relief volunteering, which draws on that. There was one of the gentlemen there was talking about archaeology, about taking veterans on archaeological digs and connecting them, back to history and exploring those sorts of things. I mean, there is a lot of creative stuff going on out there. And right. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about, let's just try anything. You never know what's going to connect with somebody.
That's wonderful, Steve. So I didn't know I was going to put you on the spot. It just so happened you came into the room just as Alan was was talking about veterans. So you've responded to that spontaneously really, really well. I wonder, Anthony, I might come to you in a second, because there's a point here about transitions. You know, I think sometimes when we focus in on a particular group, we can tend to go, oh, well, that's very interesting, but that's not the group I'm interested in, so it's not really of concern to me. But if you look just a little bit deeper, you'll find there's these common threads, not just that we're all different groups of men, but there's these different clusters of experience. And one of the key ones that came up was transition as a risk factor. So we're talking here about transition from service into civilian life. But I know a lot of the work that you do is about preparing men from the transition from working life into retirement. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that in terms of the importance of helping men build social connection as they move from work to retirement, and what's involved there.
Yeah, I guess, how long have you got?
Give us your maximum 5-minute version.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, gee. Okay, so I guess we have guys for a whole different range of ages, and I think age is important. And we have younger guys who are just in their 55, 60 who have just retired, but then we also have guys that they've been retired for 10, 15, 20 years, and it's even different. And try to keep me on track, because I will tend to go off on tangents. And it's different even from that perspective, from a guy who's just retired who comes along to our group, the Older Men's Network, and guys that that have been retired for 20 odd years. We're finding that the guys who have just retired are, they're active, and they tend to want to get into volunteering quite quickly, which is really good. Because we find volunteering, it's just one of the most important things for our group, and I think for men especially, to get involved in it at an early age. And by getting these guys who are only just retired, or even 5 or 10 years retired, into volunteering, we can keep them volunteering for 20, potentially 30 years. What we're finding though with the older guys is, unfortunately, they tend to want to the more social stuff, mainly because sometimes of health issues. Mobility and stuff does prevent them from doing certain types of volunteering and activities. So I think from our perspective, it's important to have a whole range of activities. While we like to think we specialize in social connection and meaning and purpose, we do it in so many different ways to have lots of different opportunities, perhaps too many, but we just think it's really important for fellas to get involved in that stuff that has meaning and purpose, but also that we can continue to do it almost regardless of those mobility or those health issues, or potentially even cognitive decline. We still might be able to do that stuff. And we've built relationships over those years, that transition. We've hopefully made some friends in some way, whether they're male to male friends or male to other, intergenerational programs and stuff like that. We've made friends or social connections in some way that we feel part of something as we transition from the retirement phase, honeymoon phase, into the I'm in the routine now, and I've painted the fence and I've painted the house and I've done all those things. Now what's left? By getting into the volunteering in that early transition phase, we've got something that we can fall back on, we think, when we get out of that, hopefully get out of that honeymoon phase and into that routine. We're in the routine, and that keeps us going. I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel here has had that experience, but that's something that I'm testing myself personally. It's by starting volunteering now, when I'm in my early 50s. I've started volunteering, that something that potentially I can continue to do for another 30 odd years. That's, I guess, in terms of the different ages, we're trying to find those opportunities and help those guys transition. A lot of times we do the guys that are in their, I guess, late 70s, early 80s have just lost a partner. So they're coming from a perspective of a lot of grief. And it's for us, it's about getting them, you know, they haven't necessarily made a lot of friends or kept a lot of social connections because their wives have been their social connection, and they've wholeheartedly put their whole life into that. And they find that they do lack that connection when their partner, you know, does die or leaves them, you know, or they get divorced at that late age, which is really, really sad, or tough for them. So, so by helping them get those connections, and then hopefully we can get even those older fellas, they're not useless. We've got opportunities for them to get involved in making connections with other age groups and other fellas, so that they can find that purpose. Does that kind of answer your?
Brilliant.
Sure.
Brilliant. I could have given you an hour, but that's you've given us some really great bits of wisdom to chew upon. Anthony was one of 4 speakers on a panel we had on social connection in older men. So Anthony's from the Older Men's Network in Toowoomba, doing amazing work there. We also had WA Men's Sheds. We had the Circle of Men that go into aged care settings where men are often isolated, sitting in rooms on their own with no connection. Shed Happens, which there's about 40 Shed Happens projects around the country. They always say we work on hearts, not on projects. So that's more about blokes getting together and telling their stories rather than building bird boxes and doing woodwork projects. Also, we had the Older Men New Ideas group, which is particularly strong in Victoria, but there's 1 or 2 in New South Wales. So there's some great initiatives out there for older men. I think in this conversation, as we're talking about transition, it strikes me that one of the things that we need to shift is just the cultural awareness that A, social connection is important, is something we need to nurture, and B, there are times in life when our need for social connection changes and shifts. And so, and there's lots of times when that happens, but the shift to older age and thinking ahead to how we want our social connections and our life to look as we get older is, I think, a really important part of how we can help improve men's health by just encouraging those of us in our 50s now, Anthony, though neither of us look it.
I think I think it's important though to point out that while we talk a lot about group stuff, I don't necessarily, even though in my job we do just about everything in groups, I don't believe that has to be the option for everyone. I think it's important to talk about social connections for those people who find it hard to make social connections, because, you know, I talk to a lot of guys out in the community that are referred to us who don't want to be part of groups, you know, that scares them, you know, either because of mental health or personality or whatever it is. And you know, at a talk I did last year, I actually got pulled up on it. I kept talking about groups, and groups are great, and this is that. And this person called me out and said, well, I don't want to be part of a group. Does that mean my life is over? And I'm like, whoa, okay, hang on a second. And I had to take a back seat and say, well, no, actually it's not. And I thought about it and went, well, we also try to help fellas who are in that situation find social connection or find their social hit that they need from their personality to still get those benefits of social connection that we might get in group settings. You know, and there's a lot of guys out there, and it's a gap that we've kind of identified in that, you know, 40 to 65 year age group, where there's a lot of guys out there who are on their own. They have mental health issues, not potentially serious mental health issues, and I don't say that lightly, but they don't have any social connection, and we need to find ways to help them get that social hit that they need without the pressure of, you've got to be in a group, you know, you've got to do this in a group, because it's not always,
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and that's where you need a mix of
Yeah.
you need things at a more sort of social structural level, which just create opportunities for bumping into people, which
Yeah.
events and activities that are open for all, but you don't have to become part of a group to
Yeah.
engage with them. And at the other end of the scale, you may need actual targeted interventions. You may need
Yep.
things like befriending or mentoring, or a connector who's actually just looking out for people and connecting them to the right type
Buddy,
of
just a
people.
buddy, buddy
Yeah.
to a wingman, or whatever. Yeah.
Totally. Groups are not for everyone, but that regular activity that's open to all are definitely part of the solution, but not the whole solution. I'm going to move on. We've got a question from Paul Justice. So looks like a complicated question. It's actually quite a simple one. Paul, what innovations have been implemented for men's health improvement and social inclusion since the 2019 men's health strategy was announced, and is the right? That's the first part. In terms of social inclusion, really an easy answer, pretty much nothing. Not really included in the activity underneath the men's health strategy. However, it's nearly 4 years since 2019. There has been a grassroots up explosion of innovative men's groups in the past 4 years. A lot of what's happening is being driven from the grassroots up, and it's not being driven from the top down. I think if you look back at I've made this point before, but if you look back at the men's sheds movement 30 years ago, the same thing was happening. Sheds were popping up from the grassroots. They weren't a coordinated top-down innovation. They were a grassroots up innovation. But now the top down and the bottom up have met, and now you get chunks of funding from the Department of Health to support the men's sheds movement. And one of the points we've been making over the last 3 or 4 years is that eventually in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there will be a recognition that these other forms of groups for men of different ages are also health interventions that need to be supported. And we're saying, why not recognize that now rather than waiting 10, 20, 30 years to recognize it? Because you will do eventually. So speed up the process. The second part of the question, which takes us a bit outside of this conversation, but I'm happy to briefly answer, is this strategy still being supported with the change of federal government? Yes, still at a low level. The government's still trying to work out exactly how it supports the men's health strategy, but it is still supported. Certainly not to the same extent as the women's health strategy. For example, they've introduced a national council of advisors to support the women's health strategy. The work on the men's health strategy is lagging and slower, but it does exist. What has been found that works in different age ranges and demographics of location and cultural backgrounds? That's a massive question. We just talked a little bit about older men there. I think there's a big missing in our conversation about what will work for younger men, and I think that needs to be explored. We certainly had a really meaty session in terms of culturally and linguistically diverse men, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about that as this conversation unfolds. I hope that answers your questions, Paul. Men living with disabilities and no longer working, again, to be explored. I came across certainly some initiatives around what would you say now, neurodiverse men on the autism spectrum, who clearly have an additional barrier to social connection and interaction. And I think that's an area that really needs to be explored, and we'd like to look into further. Paul, do you want to come in on any of those? I can't answer all the questions, but is there a particular part you want to speak to?
When you said about neurodiversity, there's a lot of men that fall in that AOD spectrum of having disorders because they can't socially connect, and that's where men are highlighted as a high thing. I work as a lived experience peer worker at a hospital and health service, and in an NGO in the community, and I see it all the time. I see, like you said, more initiatives to women's health things. When you bring up some of the stuff around men, it seems harder. And the thing too is there's a lot of men falling in between the gaps around NDIS. As you said, that a lot of men identify with a disability but can't get NDIS because they don't fall into the box they need to tick for an insurance policy, because that's what it is. It's an insurance scheme. and then they fall out of connection with the things and they try to connect, but they don't have the supports to connect unless they find they.
Yeah, that certainly confirms a lot of our sort of perceptions and suspicions. We're not actually hearing it a lot in the conversations, but we're picking up the whispers of it. It's certainly flagged up in the 10 to Men study. We had the 10 to Men study come and present their findings on social connection, and they highlighted men with disabilities as a high risk group. Another example of how women's health has far more structures in place than men's health is that there is a national alliance of women with disabilities. It almost seems like the assumptions that men with disabilities are already taken care of because they're men, whereas there needs to be a particular focus on women with disabilities. I think we're massively missing the gendered needs of men with disabilities, and there's a big chunk of work for us to do there, I think.
But if you look, there was a sociology study in 2013. In that study, it said that 63.5% of men identify as having a disability, 37.5 or 30, I think 37.5 of women identify with a disability. So the averages of disability for men or comorbidity health condition are higher because of the lifestyle and the work they do. And the thing that shows too, if you look at work cover records, that high of accident incidents that happens for men in the workplace. And around that wellness, well-being and everything isn't actually supported compared to for women, because the structure in their work is different to men most of the time.
Yeah, again, definitely getting whispers of that we need to look into further. I've just remembered that one of the areas that did come up in our conversation the last couple of weeks was with older men. High rates of deafness is the second highest disability in men. For women, it's the 8th highest disability. And just how losing hearing and becoming deaf in older age can just really exacerbate the ability to connect with others, and is something that more men seem to experience, probably because of the industrial injuries, the workplace issues you're talking about. Thanks for that contribution, Paul. We'd love to hear more from you. I'm going to move on. JM, is that Jack? That's Jack Mulholland. Do you want to come in and say that, Jack, or I'll just read it out for you? Do you want to pop in and share your point? You can do.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Been lucky enough to work with a program in Melbourne. Started out in Ringwood, or actually Kilsyth, called Different Journeys. It's autism-based program that's sort of done so well. It's sort of spreading around Victoria at the moment. Look, they've got 2 programs, one for, I guess, teenagers and one for your young adults. There was a group of young teenagers who are now in their young adults. Virtually all of them had no social connection prior to coming to the program. And now there's a group of 7 of them that regularly see each other, and they become great friends. And they do they still come to Different Journeys as the young adults program, but they do so many great things outside the program. They virtually created their own friendship. So it's sort of a program that's done extremely well in the neurodiverse field, or with autism there, in a social area where we really haven't seen success like this before. And as a result, their programs are popping up everywhere, and they're working with more and more councils and other areas across Victoria. So, yeah.
What are the factors of success, Jack, do you think, if the program?
Definitely, because it's been run by the lived experience. So the lady who runs it, Mel Spencer, who one of the co-founders, she's has 3 children with autism herself. She's as they're progressing, got funding. Everyone she's employed just about falls in that lived experience category. She's employed young people with autism to help in there, but she's also employed carers. So everyone there has a great understanding, and I think that's what makes it work. And as a result, the other benefit being is that families have met other families. So there've been really great connections between carers. And so where they previously weren't understood or had sort of, no understanding amongst their own family, they've now met a whole lot of other families who completely understand their journey and and some of the things that they have to negotiate.
Right. So it's not just benefiting the individual, it's benefiting the family constellation around the, yeah, brilliant. That's great. Sure. I'd really love to find out more about that. That's thanks for sharing that, Jack. And again, making those connections. It's a couple of times it's come up. I think 3 times now we've heard about the value of peers. I think Steve was talking about, you know, peers in veteran work. Paul mentioned being a peer worker, and you've just mentioned like peers and lived experience there. So I think it's important to remember that piece, that it's not all about like, you know, doing services to people. It's about empowering people to provide support for others with similar experiences is a massive part of this. I don't want to put people on the spot, but I have noticed that both Kumar from Sydney and Ukash, who's I think from a multicultural men's group in South Australia, I think, are with us. And if either of you guys want to jump in and just add any perspectives in terms of social connection in culturally and linguistically diverse men, or respond to any of the conversation, you're very welcome. I'm aware you might not be able to, but I'm just going to have that invitation out there. Okay. So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. So going to bring it to a close. As is always the case when we start this conversation, we could go deeper and deeper and deeper, but this has been added more layers, and in some ways, as often the case, has posed a few more questions for me than it's answered, which is good. There's more work to be done. Any sort of final thoughts and reflections that anyone's got on today's presentation, or any part of the series that they've participated in, or just broadly on the topic of building social connection in men? Very happy to hear from you before we clock off.
I'll just jump in. Glennis just given me some ideas to expand the various activity volunteering stuff I'm involved with. Reaching out to Steve down the line at some point with some other stuff that I do that might connect veterans with each other. That's another story. And I'll just do a plug for my little chat room business about there's not enough men in the health consumer advocacy roles, which is a presentation I'm doing in Japan next month about how do we engage more men. There are men doing it, but it's an interesting one where it's mostly women in that field, and we need to have more men putting their input into what does and doesn't work, from with research trials, safety, safe health stuff in Victoria, etc., etc. So if anybody's wants to get involved in volunteering, you know, the major hospitals, Peter Mac here, etc., they're always looking for consumer advocates, but particularly men, because they bring a different perspective to it. So that's an ongoing one. That's always there.
Right. Thanks, Alan. Anyone else? All good. So with just under 2 minutes short of time, I'm going to bring it to a close. So what's next? We will turn this month-long conversation into our first significant report, specifically on social connection and men's health. We will certainly be looking to connect with initiatives like Ending Loneliness Together and adding our voice to the call for more government action on this issue. But I think a next major part of our conversation, as I've alluded to, is for us to play a connecting role between some of those great projects that are out there, running between them, maybe 400, 500, 600 groups across Australia for men who currently aren't getting really any of the recognition or the funding or the support that they deserve. And there's a lot of great knowledge within those groups that can be shared with them, with practitioners, and potentially shared with individual blokes as well. So those are the next steps for us. In terms of Men's Health Connected, our next series will, starting in a couple of weeks, will be on exercise and men's health. And look out for our next session on male suicide prevention. as we are yet to officially launch our very important national campaign, Time to Act on Male Suicide, which is seeking to influence the next National Suicide Prevention Plan, which is being developed as we speak. So apart from that, thanks all of you for your contribution. Thanks for showing up today. I hope you found it useful, and do stay in touch. Let's keep the conversation going.